Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Ask the Doctor. Today we are learning how to breathe easy, functional medicine approach to respiratory health. We are being taught by an incredible teacher, teaches, trains, and lectures doctors all over the world, has done more than 10,000 hours worth of teaching, and is in the 33rd year of clinical practice. None other than the amazing Dr. Bob Rakowski.
Well, Carol, thank you always, and happy, beautiful day all. And when we look at this title, Breathe Easy, that actually, there might be a learning curve. I think a lot of people are going to be surprised at the information that we share, but the vast majority of people, and I'm talking in the high upper 90th percentile in this environment, don't breathe well. And the data is overwhelming. And if we breathe right, we can, add so much value to our bodies and to our life. So yes, in clinical practice now, over 30 years, I've seen all ends of the spectrum, the elite and people sent home to die. And I absolutely love teaching. So I've taught all over the world, and this is a beautiful way for me to stay sharp and share. So this week, literally, I covered multiple books on breathing and even learned a whole lot more than I previously knew about lungs and respiration and breathing. And I'll share that with you. So we'll talk a little bit about oxygen. It is a lost art of breathing. And, I hope everybody is inspired to breathe a little better with instruction after we're done with this. Here's a fact, and this might shock you, but if we breathe less, we live more. And I'm going to show you data on that. They actually suggest that it's optimal for us to breathe 3 to 5 times a minute. That's it. And most of us are probably 12, 16, maybe even 20 times a minute. And there's a number of problems with that. We'll talk about mouth breathing versus nose breathing. We'll look at infections, although I'm going to come back to that at the end. And we're going to talk about a very simple over-the-counter thing, hydrogen peroxide. And with something called a nebulizer, there's a medical doctor that says no one should ever have an upper respiratory infection again. And you know what? Our immune system uses hydrogen peroxide to kill yeast, virus, bacteria, parasite, even cancer. So he might have something going on there that can be valuable. We'll look at asthma, allergies, bronchitis, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, a little bit on lung cancer, and let's dive right in. So, I think most of us realize that air, and especially oxygen, is the most critical nutrient for us. So, we can go essentially 30 days without food, 3 days without water. They say 3 hours without shelter in a really extreme environment, and 3 minutes without air. So that's going to be the most critical thing that we need to get in on a regular basis. And I have to tell you, I really enjoy this journalist. His name is James Nestor. And when he talks about breathing and breath, he talks about his own challenges with nasal challenges, allergies, obstructive sleep apnea, a whole bunch of problems, extreme fatigue, and a single breath workshop changed his life. And he thought, what is going on here? How can that make such a big difference? And so literally he started investigating it, and he said, look, I didn't have a slant on it. I didn't have an angle on it. I didn't have any money to be made. I just wanted to find out what was going on and inform the world. And here's the rock solid conclusion. Humans have lost their ability to breathe correctly. Now, the good news is that we can get it back. So this book, Perfect Breathing, and I love this part from the book. It says our breath is the primary connection between our mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being. And there's good data on all of those. So the healing power of breath, take a look at this. Breath unites all peak performances. So they'll ask the question, what do Mahatma Gandhi, Bruce Lee, Buddhist meditators, Christian monks, Hawaiian kahunas, and Russian special forces all have in common? They actually use breathing to enhance all aspects of their wellness, and especially in crisis circumstances. And I'm going to get not to Russian special forces, but Navy SEALs, and they're taught to breathe, take a deep, fast, cleansing, nourishing nasal breath when you are absolutely in the heat of battle. So this is a pretty fascinating graph of longevity. This was a 2021 study. And then when they found out when people were really, really good with lung function, deep breathing, diaphragmatic breathing, we'll talk about that a little bit later. But those people that had the best lung function lived the best longest. And that's, probably something that we're always going to want to go for. And I tell people in my health journey of health studies, it was probably close to 40 years ago that I looked at biomarkers of human aging. And it turns out that vital capacity, how deep a breath we can take, at that time was the top biomarker of longevity and healthy aging. Now, fast forward to 2021, and they're absolutely showing that when people have the best lung function, they live the best longest. And by the way, when they have the worst, they're going to die early and be kind of miserable along the way. So if you don't have good lung function, look out. You're not going to be able to exert yourself or even handle stress effectively. So they're calling it a global health marker, and I absolutely agree. And the good news is at any age, we can improve lung function. When we start talking about slow breathing, and they're talking about 3 to 6 times a minute, and I'll show a reference on the magic of 5.5 breaths per minute. But notice what it says. When people are slow breathers, and in this article, they said they define slow as 3 to 6 breaths per minute, they'd had improved respiratory muscle activity, ventilation, meaning oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange efficiency, chemoreflex and baroreflex sensitivity. What does that mean is it changed the chemistry of the blood and the pressure of the blood more effectively. Heart rate variability is a relatively new marker of health, vitality, and dynamic performance. Blood flow dynamics, respiratory sinus arrhythmia. So this is very fascinating, but when they're talking about sinus arrhythmia, they're talking about the heart, actually. You can have sinus tachycardia, but some of that can be related to poor breathing, the coupling or the interaction between the heart and the lungs, and then even the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system balance, meaning your fight or flight nervous system versus your rest and recovery nervous system. So all of those things are enhanced by slow breathing. And by the way, I really like this graphic. Notice it shows the air going in the nose because that's what we should do. It shows the chest expanding, and it should, and that's a very important marker of how much air we can put in our lungs. And it shows the diaphragm descending, and that should happen. It should compress our abdominal organs. And when we take a deep diaphragmatic breath, deep abdominal breath, one of my mentors years ago used to talk about Buddha breathing, Buddha belly. You let that belly come out as you're breathing, because as that's coming down, the belly should expand and really allow that vacuum of the lungs to be filled. So ultimately, another more expanded picture of what's going on. Here, abdomen is going to expand. Here it contracts. Now, can you take a deep breath without, extending your abdomen? And the answer is yes. Fighters do it all the time. They can breathe in deep and tense that abdominal wall, and it'll actually bring in good pressure. But in a relaxed state, you should let that abdomen relax and let that belly go out and in and out and in, and a very good way to get air into your lungs. I'm going to get to the Navy SEALs a little bit later, but this is Commander Mark Devine, the head of the Navy SEALs Special Forces. And in his book, The Unbeatable Mind, he talked about how he was in a very life-threatening circumstance in a time of war as a Navy SEAL underwater with problems with his breathing apparatus, problems with visibility, not having enough oxygen to probably go the distance that he wanted to, all at the time while enemies were shooting at him. And he remembered his training, and he called it box breathing. And what he would do was inhale for a count of 5, hold it for a count of 5, exhale for a count of 5, hold the exhale for a count of 5. And he said that extended his oxygen, kept him calm enough to actually swim to safety. When he said, he thought if he didn't have the presence of mind and training to do that, that would have been his last day on planet Earth. So phenomenal symmetry in this. So check it out according to James Nestor, extensive studies. Perfect breath is this: breathe in for about 5.5 seconds, exhale for 5.5 seconds. So there was no holding time on that. That's about 5.5 breaths a minute for a total of about 5.5 liters of air if you have the average lung capacity. And I think it's pretty fascinating that nature has this level of synergy. But here's the takeaway from all of this: breathe slower, breathe through your nose. And when someone's a mouth breather, and this was James Nestor on a Joe Rogan podcast, and Joe Rogan said, by the way, he had his nose broken as a young fighter. And I think he was about 40 when he got his nose fixed. And suddenly he could breathe through his nose, and he said his entire life got better. And if you're breathing through your mouth, what the data is now is that your skull will not develop ideally. And so there's a lot of things that happen in your structure that make us much, much, much less healthy. So they're actually calling mouth breathing de-evolution. And when they would look at older skulls, they found something very fascinating. We're talking about skulls that are 100,000 years old. They found a broader dental arch. They found better nasal passages. They found a more full, round face. And you know what? When they looked at these skulls, and sometimes the people were 40, 50, 60 years old, no evidence of dental decay. Now, someone might say, well, that's because of their better diet, and that certainly is a component to it. But there's also evidence that when we breathe appropriately through our nose, we change our chemistry in a way that enhances our immune system. And we're not breathing through the mouth. We're not getting as many bacteria in that oral cavity. And that can be a difference there too. So if you're a mouth breather, not so good for your jaw or mouth. It's bad for your sleep. I'll show you data on that. You're actually going to exhale a lot more water, so it's dehydrating. So mouth breathers may have to keep water at their bedside and believe it or not, even wake up and urinate more often. And it's certainly not good for our brain. Whereas we look at nose breathing, I'll show you the peer-reviewed medical studies after this. It does clean our air. That's one of the functions of the nose. It does help us to sleep better because it gets us in a rest and recovery mode. Our noses may be the greatest sources of nitric oxide, stored nitric oxide in the body. And that's absolutely phenomenal. We'll talk about nitric oxide, molecule of the year, Nobel Prize winning molecule, critical for heart health, brain health, immune function, sexual function. And by the way, there's a huge link between healthy nasal breathing and healthy sexual function. Next week, we're actually doing sexual function as our topic. Decreases anxiety and stress, and even is anti-allergenic. So when we start looking at the structure of our nose, it's a very, very complex organ system. It's not two holes there for air to go in. It's literally an extension of our brain to the outside world. Literally, this is the only place that our brain touches the outside world. And that's very important because our nose senses a lot about the environment. But notice it talks about these turbinates, which are actually going to spin the air. And some people will say it actually charges the air, but it's responsible for warming, moisturizing, and filtering the air that we breathe. And all of that is going to be healthier for our lungs. When you start looking at sleep, pretty interesting study on sleep. This was 2020. Says nasal obstruction is common in sleep apnea. And so there is a special type of mouth tape, and I just bought some that I'm excited to try out tonight. I had bought a different type of mouth tape years ago, and when I taped my mouth shut to sleep, it was so annoying, I didn't even make it through the second night. But James Nestor says, you know what? They found out that you do just enough. He says you get like a little Charlie Chaplin mustache and you lower it down a little bit. If you just cover the center of your lips, that's good enough for you to keep your mouth shut when you breathe. And it's nowhere near as annoying as that big strip of tape all the way across. Powerful PubMed study here. The nasal and mucosal sinuses may have the highest reserve of nitric oxide in the entire body. So that is absolutely phenomenal. And nitric oxide is a life-critical molecule that won a Nobel Prize. So here we're talking about dilating blood vessels, but it also dilates airways. And when you look at nitric oxide, what's it good for? Energy production, blood flow, physical endurance, insulin, preventing diabetes, lowers blood pressure, lowers cholesterol, good for the kidneys, good for libido, can actually prevent some of the damage from harmful things like cigarette smoke, enhances brain function, and is anti-aging. All of that, and we enhance that when we start breathing through our nose. Later on, we'll talk a little bit about the value of an anti-inflammatory diet and my favorite anti-inflammatory herb, Ganoderma lucidum. But inflammation is one of the things that really devours nitric oxide. And since I tend to think in pictures, I teach in pictures. So this is a python swallowing a sheep. And that's my representation of how inflammation devours nitric oxide. And there's a reference on Ganoderma lucidum. And I will come back to this again and again for a lot of different reasons. It's the most nutritious food on the planet. And when we deliver it in coffee and tea, people get it multiple times a day. They never need to be reminded. They never plan to quit. And it's so good for the body in so many ways. So here's a 2021 peer-reviewed medical study. Within the article, it says an efficient way to manage anxiety is abdominal breathing. They didn't specifically call out nose breathing, but when you take that deep breath, and you know what, maybe if you're in a real extreme circumstance, feel free to use your mouth with it too. But if we practice nose breathing, we're going to get all of these other benefits. Jocko Willink, I've read 3 books by him, the US ground commander in Iraq, the head of the Navy SEALs, just a, American hero, absolute beast, good guy, smart guy. But he says what they taught him in SEAL training was if you're in a really tough circumstance, the first thing you do is breathe. Then you assess the circumstances, you make a decision, and then you execute an action. When we start talking about allergies, when there's immune imbalance, and I'm always a big fan of balancing the immune system, because if we don't have ideal immune function, we're going to have problems. Too little defense against foreign invaders leads to infection. Too much reaction against foreign particles is allergy. Too much attack on the inside is autoimmunity. Too little defense on the inside is cancer. Interestingly enough, nitric oxide is shown to have benefits in all of these circumstances. And here's a very comprehensive immune protocol where when we give the right amount of vitamin D, DHEA, Ganoderma, perilloceid, the omega-3 resolvins, and repair the gut, we balance the immune system. So allergy can calm down, and yet infection can go away. Autoimmunity can go away, and the body can enhance its defense against cancer. All of those things can happen simultaneously when we have a good, functional, and balanced immune system. When we start looking at asthma, there's a pandemic of this. There's so many kids out there that are suffering. And I could do a longer lecture on asthma, which I've done in the past, but here's what we know. Around the globe, about 1 in 13 people have asthma. So, it's not uncommon at all, and it's becoming more and more common. And when you look around the world, where do we have the worst incidence of it? North America, a little bit of South America and Australia. Well, these are going to be the more westernized countries with a very pro-inflammatory type diet. So this is a 2019 PubMed. And notice what it says. Although no cure is currently available, it is well recognized that some asthma patients can spontaneously enter remission later in life. Well, here's what I'm going to tell you. If it can go away, why don't we just figure out how it goes away and make it go away? And I'll tell you, in my clinical practice, I can't think of the last asthma patient that I saw that we didn't make a big difference in fast by, creating strategies that balance their immune system, reduce their allergies, modulated their inflammatory process. And very, very simply, asthma is a chronic inflammatory condition of the lower airways. I'm trying to think if I've given talks on chronic disease for Ask the Doctor. If I haven't, I might consider doing that at some point in time. I'll be lecturing at a major pharmacology conference this fall, talking about chronic disease and how really the functional medicine lifestyle approach prevents it. But the chronic diseases that they're talking about include diabetes, prediabetes, cardiovascular, cancer, depression, autoimmune, neurodegeneration, breakdown of muscle and bone, and shutting down of the immune system. And they all fall into being triggered by, guess what? The big four: stress, toxins, malnutrition, and physical inactivity. And notice they said systemic chronic inflammation leads to several diseases that represent the greatest cause of disability and death on the entire planet, but we're earning it with bad lifestyle choices, including things like asthma. The big triggers of asthma: allergies, toxins, and infections. Now, this was a fairly new study, and I found it pretty phenomenal. So here's what it says: analysis of health outcomes in vaccinated and unvaccinated children. They looked at developmental delays, that's delay in brain development, asthma, ear infections, and gastrointestinal disorders. And here's what they found out. And they just looked at the first year of life. Kids that were vaccinated versus those that weren't, 218% increased risk of developmental delay, 449% increased risk of asthma, 213% increased risk of ear infections, and 147% increased risk of gastrointestinal disorders. So, I think people are waking up and saying, you know what? I wonder if my doctor has really looked into what he's recommending for me. And I think if you go in with data like this and share, you might say, well, doctor, I'd like your opinion on this. Does this change your ideas? And I tell people way back when Tony Robbins did a webinar, or I guess it was a live seminar on immunizations. And he went around and interviewed dozens of physicians and asked them, by the way, what's in that vaccine? And he said of the dozens that he asked, not one of them could answer. They actually didn't know the ingredients. There's an epigenetic phenomena potentially to asthma. Moms who are under higher levels of stress have children that are much more likely to have asthma. And then when we have polluted airways, these are strong triggers of airway challenges, including asthma. And even obesity is a major risk factor for asthma. In fact, obesity is a risk factor for about everything that we don't want, including the #2 risk factor for cancer. And part of it is going to be that when you have excess fat, your body will be more inflamed. So when I recommend comprehensive protocols, I tell people, we have a nutrition pyramid. At the base of it is food. Then we go with superfoods, medical foods, a good multivitamin, multimineral. The activating omega-3s are resolvent form, probiotics. Someone came unmuted there. So let's see here. Who's on? So, all right. So anyways, so we wanted to be very, very comprehensive in terms of our nutrition. And when you look at an anti-inflammatory diet versus a pro-inflammatory diet, if God made it, it's okay. If man made it, stay away. One thing that I'll take issue with is this steak here. If it's actually a grass-fed organic steak with animals not fed antibiotics and stuff like that, that's actually an anti-inflammatory food. But the factory farm stuff, absolutely terrible. Then we get to my favorite superfood, Ganoderma lucidum. It opens airways by more mechanisms than prescription inhalers, and it's phenomenal for long-term allergy relief. When we start looking at COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, they're actually suggesting that this is something that can't go away. At least that's what the medical model has been for a while, but yet now we're beginning to see that there is some resolution possible. And I'll share some of that with you. But best strategies: kill off chronic infection, avoid smoking, avoid air pollution. In this book here, Reversing COPD. And ultimately, you said, you know what, so far, the only things they've seen really good success with are lung transplant and stem cells. But here I want to call out what this article said: epigenetic rewriting. That means not your genes, but the information you give your genes with lifestyle choices. By eating right, drinking right, thinking right, moving right, sleeping right, pooping right, they're knowing that that can restore some function in people. So Wendell Betts, a really phenomenal case study. You can see him on MSNBC. But basically, he was able to use Ganoderma coffee and reverse his, extremely compromised lungs. He was down to something like 21% function. And within a few months, more than doubled that and was able to get off of oxygen. Yeah, I'm going to try to play this. Sometimes it goes okay, sometimes it doesn't, but I'll play Wendell.
Yeah, let's go with it. Hi, my name's Wendell Betts, and it will be 3 years ago this Sunday that I actually received my first order from Organo. At the time, I was severe COPD diagnosed. My lungs were at 23% capacity, and 2 months before I joined Organo, my pulmonary doctor actually told me that nobody has ever recovered from 23%, that the next time I get sick, I would either end up intubated the rest of my life or I would die. I said, I'm not going to go on a machine that's not living. So in August, late August of 2013, somebody gave me some samples of Organo. 21 days after I started drinking the product, I came off of oxygen. That was September 15th, 2013. I have not taken oxygen since. My lungs went from 23% to 29%, 34% to 40%. And now this summer, I'm able to walk 3, 4, 5 miles at a time without any type of assistance. So Ganoderma works. Dr. Bob knows all about it. He's a fantastic guy. I love his videos, and he's asked me to do this. I am not getting paid for this. I love Ganoderma. I love Organo Gold. Try it. You will not be sorry. Thank you.
So fun video there. And so here, again, out of PubMed, chronic bronchitis is one of the factors of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. This is the language where I got the article. For centuries, so hundreds of years, Ganoderma lucidum has been used in Oriental medicine for the treatment of chronic bronchitis. Finally, when we start looking at cancer, perfect storm of cancer, low oxygen, low nutrients, high acid, chronic inflammation, immune suppression. We want to unwind all aspects of the perfect storm of cancer to give people the greatest chance of survival. And Ganoderma lucidum, very powerful as a direct anti-lung cancer, which, by the way, medicine does not have good success with that. And again, Ganoderma has a lot of compounds that have anti-cancer activity. And so finally, now we're going to talk about the last topic, and that's upper respiratory infection. And so one of my good students, I don't know if she's on here or not, but Dr. Bonita Harris, she said, hey, Dr. Bob, I see you're doing lung health next week. Do you know about this nebulizing hydrogen peroxide? She sent me a really nice video. And this medical doctor said, you know what? There's no reason for anybody ever to have an upper respiratory infection again. Hydrogen peroxide is what our white blood cells, our immune cells, use to kill infection. And we're talking about virus, yeast, parasite, bacteria, fungus, and it can even kill cancer cells. But notice what it says. Hydrogen peroxide is widely used, highly accessible, and available chemical compound whose efficacy has been demonstrated on several human viruses, including the coronavirus and influenza viruses. So this is a portable nebulizer, and you can use just very dilute hydrogen peroxide in water and put that right over your face and breathe it into the airways. Powerful. So that takes us to our questions and answers. And do we have any questions or answers?
Yes, we do. And the first one, I'm going to go a little bit out of order. Can artificial light and radiation from electronic devices affect respiratory health?
I would think they could. And so let me give you a mechanism. So one, the ionizing radiation, that's still something we need to look at. And, we know that, first of all, the high-end spectrums, like the X-rays, the gamma rays, those are things that can be really, really bad. When you start looking at the lower end, like microwave and 5G, there's not human data on that yet, but there's some people that just feel lousy, and other people say they put a 5G tower up and this tree dies in a short period of time. So if we start talking about artificial light, first and foremost, more data on that. When we have light that's not natural, when it has blue hues to it, like screens, and now my screen has an app where I don't get as many blue hues, that actually suppresses melatonin. When it suppresses melatonin, the body has more cortisol, When the body has cortisol for too long, it becomes cortisol resistant, and then it has a hard time dampening inflammation. And inflammation is the enemy of health, the enemy of nitric oxide, and the enemy of airways. So for sure, the artificial light and likely the different types of electromagnetic radiation as another form of pollution.
What are some ways to maintain integrity of our lung health?
Well, we're going to breathe right. That's going to be that nasal breathing. And, how often should we do it? They basically said all day long. The more consciously we breathe. I don't know if anybody here has ever tried to breathe, 3 to 6 times a minute. There have been different times where I've been in the practice of that. And I'll tell you what, you have to be very, very conscious to breathe like that. But now the data is very, very clear, and work on expanding your chest, keep your shoulders down and back, work on getting that diaphragm going down deeper. Those are all ways to breathe better. And keep in mind, you want to breathe, hopefully clean air. But even when our air is not clean, and it's hard to find, there's probably no perfect air on planet Earth anymore. When you go through your nose, it's going to filter it, it's going to humidify it, it's going to condition it, it's going to ionize it in a way that helps you. So nose breathing is apparently the way to go.
Okay, next question. You mentioned upper respiratory system. What is the difference and impact between lower and upper?
Well, upper is going to be the part here, the bronchioles, when you start coughing stuff up, that's that common respiratory infection. If it's lower, it tends to be more problematic. If you get infection down deep in the lungs, it's harder to get rid of. It can be more problematic. And so it's just a matter of, what's the arbitrary cutoff, so our lungs, if I were to stand up in a way that you could see, my lungs are going to go all the way down to here. And then, I've got a diaphragm here. And when that goes down, it actually expands my chest cavity. It's coming down even lower. But upper is pretty much just the top lobes. And the reality is most of us are very shallow breathers. We breathe only into the top of our lungs. And what we know is that there's much more efficient gas exchange in the lower parts of the lungs. So when you breathe deeper, you literally can breathe less, breathe more efficiently, slow your heart rate, lower your blood pressure, decrease your stress, decrease your anxiety, decrease your inflammatory process, increase your nitric oxide. All those things are proven. So those deep breaths, we want to get to the lower lungs when we're breathing, and we have to do that with conscious training.
Perfect. Claudio, you are up, sir. Welcome
I'm gonna
back.
check. Happy, beautiful evening, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Bob. Love the information, new topic. Would you agree that starving a body of oxygen will create a negative compounding effect through our entire body?
Absolutely. And that James Nestor's book, Breathe, he says that's what most people are unconsciously doing. When we're not breathing ideally, we suddenly become less efficient with oxygen, and it takes away from quality and quantity of life. So absolutely, you're right on the money with that.
Breath work, any links, exercises, books, audios, anywhere?
Well, let's start with Breathe. Let's start with that book, Breathe.
Okay.
But keep in mind, we gave you some ideas like the Mark Divine box breathing: in for 5, hold for 5, exhale for 5, hold for 5. I've done different types of breath seminars, and so I even watched a TED talk on it. And what he said, it's so fascinating in the TED talk. I did a weekend of what was called shamanic breath work. And it was a shaman that was hosting it, and there was different types of music, which was very, very soothing. And then you would hyperventilate. And what he said very simply is it can suddenly lead almost to like a psychedelic experience. Now, I don't know much about that, but I can tell you I was in an altered state, absolutely achieved by my breath. And my body felt different, and my mind felt different, and my imagination felt dramatically expanded. That was just one such seminar. And there's people that were at that event that said, oh my gosh, I want to take this to the rest of the world. And that spun off and led other people doing breath work. But there's many different types of breath work. Wim Hof has a type of breathing. He's known as the Iceman. And someone asked me about it earlier, so I prepared a Wim Hof slide. But people will often ask, well, what about the Wim Hof method? And the reality is it works. And here's what James Nestor said. He said, look, all these breathing techniques work You just have to know when to use them. So this guy is absolutely a master at managing his autonomic nervous system. So there he is sitting on the ice, and he might sit there for 3, 4, 5 hours. He ran the Antarctic Marathon in a pair of shorts, no shirt, minus 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, swam for a couple of hours in the Arctic Sea. And I know people that are certified in the Wim Hof breath method. I bought his app, and they will have you hyperventilate first. And 30 deep breaths, 3/4 breath out, and then a full breath out, max hold, and then recovery breathe in 10 seconds. You do that 3 times. And you know what? I've done that and I felt dizzy. And here's what James Nestor and other people say. You're actually putting your body in a forced, stressed circumstance that it has to adapt to. And somehow, some way, Wim Hof has worked with a lot of people with autoimmunity, where when they practice this breathing pretty consistently, there's been documented resolution of the autoimmune circumstance. So you can check out the Wim Hof method. Reality is there's a lot of breathing methods out there. And what James Nestor says is there's something to all of them.
I kind of want to springboard off that. I read something, or I think I heard something on YouTube or something like that. Anyways, where the fella had high blood pressure and actually almost instantaneously through breathing made it lower, like, within the right ranges and stuff. Now, of course, I tried that and I was unsuccessful. What can our expectation be that way?
Well, it depends on how long you've had it. So my rule on high blood pressure is, you've got this tube, it's called an artery, and blood goes through it. And there's muscles on the inside of the tube. So when these muscles grow, they grow into the tube. So the tube becomes smaller. So blood pressure, if you don't get after it early enough, it gets harder and harder to manage it. And that's why they call it the silent killer. But keep in mind that with our nasal passages being the body's greatest reserve of nitric oxide, you breathe in appropriate through the nose. And what does that do? It dilates blood vessels as much as 62%. And so if it was triggered by lack of nitric oxide and too much drive of the sympathetic nervous system, nasal breathing could drive the parasympathetic nervous system and nitric oxide and could lower the blood pressure. And so James Nestor, he really went the extra mile to figure this out. He funded an experiment at Stanford with one of the world's greatest pulmonologists and volunteered to have his nose completely obstructed for 10 days. So he had to breathe only through his mouth. And they measured a number of biometrics, including blood pressure, heart rate variability, oxygenation, immune status, sleep apnea, et cetera. And to no big surprise, every parameter they looked at started failing the first day of having complete nasal obstruction and started recovering the first day of relieving the nose. So do we need bigger studies? Maybe, because it was a small study, but nonetheless, the emerging body of evidence is clear. We don't breathe well. And if we breathe better, we should live better.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Excellent. Does anybody else have any questions?
Yeah, there was something a little bit too technical maybe that I opted to not put in the main presentation, but I'll share it since we have a second or two. And so one of the things that I've taught for years is where we make 94.4% of our energy is the mitochondria. So oxygen and some fuel source goes in, carbon dioxide and water come out. So these are the primary waste products of the cell, but carbon dioxide then adds to that water outside and forms carbonic acid. And so ultimately, the number one toxin that our body makes is acid, which is derived from carbon dioxide. And I was trying to get a rock solid quantification on this, but the articles that I read that didn't have rock solid backing said that 70% of our detoxification actually occurs through the process of exhaling. So we want to make sure that we're breathing ideally and efficiently. And if we don't get rid of that carbon dioxide or that acid that we're building, we're going to be inefficient and die early. So important point there. So there's so much to this breathing phenomena. Next week, we have sexual function. And within that book, James Nestor actually talks about nitric oxide in the nasal cavities and how really good nose function could be quite good for, you know, someone's love life. So just another way of looking at that. Pretty phenomenal there. So, all right. With that said, next week, sexual function. I appreciate you all always. And good night, all. And God bless.